Good morning, everybody. I'm going to pace. My background is in the philosophy of the human sciences, and I've taught in universities since 1990 to graduates and undergraduates. And I've particularly specialized in the philosophy of psychology and medicine. And what I taught, this is essential background information, by the way, for what I'm about to say about the transgender child. What I taught to students largely is that since their inception in the late 19th century, psychology and medicine haven't been neutral sciences as they are perceived in the popular imagination. So I have deconstructed the science of medicine and psychology. And what I've also taught is that psychology and medicine help construct what it means to be human, including what it means to be an embodied, sexed human, and that they always do so in a cultural context that they then go on to help shape. The philosopher who has informed my work is the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who died in 1984. And just briefly, I was in the academy from the 1990s when queer theory started to emerge as the dominant theory. So I watched the hegemony of queer theory as it became in action. And just to let you know that while I was talking about the body and intersectional feminism was growing, the worst slur which was given to me by intersectional feminists was that I was a biological essentialist. And this had the power to chill, just as the power of the word TERF and bigot and transphobe has the power to chill. So, back to the transgender child. I was first introduced to the transgender child in 2015. And I was introduced to this child in a personal context, in that a very good friend whose daughter I had known from birth sat in my kitchen and was so disturbed by what her daughter had told her that she couldn't even tell me. She handed me her, my friend handed me her laptop and showed me the letter that her daughter had written to her, explaining to her mother that she was in fact a boy and that she was socially transitioned at school, she had a new name and she wanted to go on tea, etc., etc. You can join the dots yourself. The interesting or frightening thing for me was in asking my advice about what she should do, whether she should support her daughter, my immediate reaction was absolutely not. Absolutely not. Don't go there. And she was petrified, absolutely petrified, the mother, and she was prepared to tell a lie, support her child in the lie, because she was afraid that her daughter would, as you know, commit suicide, which her daughter told her that she would do if she didn't support her. So I'm going to leave that story and tell you how I then moved on from that. So the briefest research on my part, having been my friend telling me this most bizarre tale that I found unbelievable that was happening, that the school was already socially transitioning her and so on, I did some research. And this led me to understand that the clinically sounding gender dysphoria was in fact based on ideas about transgender. So this is 2015. Now this was perplexing to me because gender which had previously been understood as a social construct, was now reified, I discovered, by the Tavistock kids, trans activists, and queer theorists as an inherent immutable property, allegedly free from any cultural influence. Gender identity was described as, in some sense, biological, i.e., it was possible to be born in the wrong body, although no one could quite explain to me which part of the body that the identity resided in. And I wasn't persuaded for one second, that the transgender child had an empirically real, verifiable, and objective existence to which W path, E path, and the Tavistock kids referred, but rather that these organizations, plus the trans activists, underpinned by queer theory, were helping to shape and construct the child. And by 2017, I had co-edited with my colleague, Professor Michelle Moore, a collection of essays by theorists critical of the concept of the transgender child. And the book is called Transgender Children Born in Your Own Body. And many of the contributors to that book are sitting in this room today. If you want to know who they are, I'll tell you about it afterwards, or they can introduce themselves. But in my own essay, I wrote that the transgender child is a fabricated figure of recent invention belonging to, rather than escaping from, excuse me. Yeah? Hold it further away? Yeah. Escaping from the, whatever I said, the historical figures that have been brought into being and then harmed by medicine, psychiatry, and psychology in the name of truth and social justice. So let me return to Foucault. I'm taking my life in my hands at this moment, I know that. So, despite his death in 1984, i.e. before transgenderism was invented, it was Foucault who provided the conceptual tools which were crucial for me in understanding that the transgender child is a social construct, and that what has been happening in gender identity medicine is medical malpractice. So how do we square the circle that I use Foucault, who is now vilified completely as a queer theorist who denies the reality of the body? Well, we'll come to that. But first, I want to perhaps bore you with a little bit of Foucauldian theory. So, Foucault's overall work has nothing to do with gender, by the way, a term he never, ever used, including he never used the term queer either, but anyway. So he was, in fact, a very heavy-duty, immensely powerful and erudite scholar who has been reduced to a cardboard cutout figure. And the purpose of his theoretical pursuits was the analysis of the liberal democratic state, in fact, and the soft forms of social control that keep social order when all of us are imagining ourselves to be free agents. There needs to be, according to Foucault, and I think it's very persuasive, some forms of soft social control to maintain order. So, liberal methods of governing, he argues, do not use the open, naked exercise of power, as in authoritarian regimes, but induce us, and this is the key point, to freely police ourselves by carrying out self-surveillance without, in a sense, our being conscious of doing so. And as an explanation for those processes, he gives medicine, psychology, and psychoanalysis. Apologies to the psychoanalysts in the audience here. He gives medicine, psychology, and psychoanalysts a central role in soft social control. So, in the name of personal and social health, these sciences have created norms for human conduct around which we police ourselves. And within that process, the sexed bodies of men and women become a particularly dense and effective area for this form of social control. So, in explaining this, Foucault now strays into the area of the body and sexuality. Some examples. In the late 20th century, nymphomania and homosexuality were newly invented medical categories based on the hypothesis of a biological instinct or drive towards heterosexuality. And in that, in the production of knowledge, of those knowledges of the biological instinct and different pathologies, psychopathologies, certain figures came into being, i.e., the nymphomaniac and the homosexual. And these were thought of as individuals who had somehow been born wrong. They had been born perverted. So they were naturalized as empirically real figures whom science had discovered, whereas it was the science, in conjunction with the cultural context of the day, that had constructed them. And the self-policing, I can hear the feedback. I'm sorry about this. If I hold it here, can you still hear me at the back? Okay. So, the self-policing works something like this. I mean, how it works within society works something like this. I'm old enough to remember when the term nymphomaniac was used regularly as an insult for sexually active women. It was as common as using the word slut. And just a little brief story. In the school that I was at, there was a girl of, I don't know, I suppose we were 13, who was regularly being abused by the boys at the local school behind the bike sheds and whatever. And she was given the name nymphomaniac. And even at that age, you know, the girls dissed her as a nymphomaniac, the boys treated her badly. And even in that, at that point, I was thinking, or I was confused. I was thinking, they're saying that she's totally sexual. She thinks about nothing else but sex. She wants sex. She's always having sex. And I was told that, you know, to be a good girl, I had to not have sex till I was married. And I was thinking, she's actually got no sexuality at all. She's an unhappy girl. She's miserable. I couldn't see how, in fact, there were sexual acts on her part. But these were my 13-year-old thoughts. But what it did was it helped police us girls. We mustn't be like that girl. Okay. So, Foucault's critique of medicalized identity is often thoroughly misunderstood. So, Andrew Doyle, for example, I don't know whether you know who he is. He's an academic, a comedian, and a broadcaster whom I hugely respect, and who is on our side, very much so, as it were, has recently argued that Foucault's thesis about the homosexual is clearly wrong. Doyle says that homosexuality is not a social construction, since it's demonstrable that the homosexual has existed throughout history. I always fail to understand this radical misreading of Foucault, because in fact Foucault is agreeing What he's saying is that same-sex activity has always existed, but it has been conceptualized differently in different historical periods. So, male homosexuality, he was not good on female same-sex attraction, I have to say. Male homosexuality has been variously thought of, for example, pre the modern period, and into the modern period, obviously, at the beginnings of modernity, as a sin against God. It wasn't medicalized, it was a sin. Or, for example, in ancient Greek culture, same-sex relationships were lauded as actually ethical practices. So, in other words, while men's same-sex activity has always existed, the homosexual, the figure of the homosexual, simply has not. In fact, the word homosexual was introduced into the medical lexicon for the first time, I think, in the 1890s. So this leads me back to the transgender child. So, like the homosexual, I argue that while the transgender child is a wholly constructed, medicalized figure, of course, unhappy, real flesh and blood children and young people confused about gender and who resist its constraints have no doubt existed throughout history, but it will have taken different forms. So, the medical construction of transgenderism as an inner condition and the subsequent and corresponding figures, the trans woman, the trans man, the trans child, they're experienced as viscerally real to those people. So, individuals, in fact, flock themselves, declare themselves trans, and others describe people as trans. This leads to for example, to children increasingly flocking to the Tavistock, or trans women experiencing any critique of transgenderism as genocide. And I think this is because the identity is we all know this, the identity is felt as so real that I think that, what's his name, Indy Willoughby, when Indy Willoughby declares, as he did recently, that trans people were, that there was a genocide of trans people and everybody was going to leave the country and find somewhere else to live, apart from being cynical in his tweeting and so on, which I think he is, and manipulative, I also understand him as genuinely feeling that fear and that threat. So, that trans women are women has, as we know, led institutions, hospitals, prisons, rape, crisis centers, etc., to proceed as if the trans woman is an empirical, verifiable, biologically grounded identity, and is not a man. So, and the absurdity of the female penis is just one example of how, in creating a category, the trans woman, and using the name, people will believe in the empirical reality of this figure, despite evidence to the contrary. So, let me get back to W-Path. So, W-Path represents itself as progressive, bravely freeing itself from the prejudiced heteronormative values of the sciences of medicine and psychology that have pathologized queer identities. So, in its quest to normalize what was seen by medicine as perverted, all it has done is reverse the locus of oppression. So, in the political quest of W-Path to normatize trans and the myriad categories that are under its umbrella. What it has done is pathologize the biologically dimorphic sexed body as being wrong, as somehow belying what can be the true, real, immutable part of the self. So, as we saw yesterday, Michael has carried out vital research on the weaknesses of the Dutch protocol in which the Tavistock Kids and other gender identity services globally have based their practices and which inform WPATH. And he's highlighted the lack of robust research about whether medicalizing children leads to the resolution of gender dysphoria. And indeed, he's highlighted the shameful hiding of contradictory evidence by the Dutch clinic and the Tavistock. I'm aware that I've got to conclude soon, so I better get on with it. And I think this is, I'm prefacing this by, I want to assure Michael and everyone else that I think that this is very important work that highlights how these clinics are failing in their claim at being based on evidence-based practices. But I want to, being a Foucauldian, I want to go a step further in my critique of gender medicine. If we are truly to hold gender medicine to account, it will not be by practicing, in my view, it will not be by practicing realpolitik, i.e. carrying out controlled studies of children and young people to diagnose the efficacy or otherwise of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. Even if one sets aside the issue of whether a child can consent, I'm putting that on the shelf at the moment, this is a deeply contradictory position to take, in my view. Since the transgender child is iatrogenic, puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones cannot relieve children and young people from unhappiness, because what they do is they further validate that the identity is real, and it's constructing the identity as real, which is the source of the problem. So, in conclusion, Foucault is casually dismissed as anti-science, postmodern queer theorist who diminishes the significance of the body and promotes an individualized politics. I urge you to discount this reductionist caricature of Foucault. And the reason why I urge you to discount it is not because I care about Foucault as such, but I do care about the throwing away of the conceptual tools that he has created for us all to use about the relationship of politics to medicine. And I'm going to give you an example of the way that he's caricatured. The philosopher Kathleen Stock, who, again, I respect, admire, and count as a friend, holds Foucault accountable for identity politics. And she has argued recently that he negates biological realities. Nothing could be further from the truth. His whole thesis is based on the argument that patriarchal and economic social structures have been successful as forms of social control by medicalizing bodies and by targeting the dimorphic sexed and reproductive bodies of women and men. And he gives a name to this power. He calls it biopower. And it's shot throughout all his work, biopower. So biopower invests with cultural meaning, and I'm going to quote Foucault, who allegedly negates the body. Biopower invests with cultural meaning what is most material and most vital, Foucault says, in female and male bodies. Other theorists are Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. In their book, Cynical Theories, they insist that Foucault is a quintessential postmodern cynical theorist who has abandoned science and reason. In contrast, what Foucault urges is the application of reason to the human sciences, which we've been persuaded to see as scientific and objective. So he's urging us to reason, not to unreason. He's urging us to understand where unreason exists and to call it out. And the philosophical task for all of us within a Foucauldian framework is an historical awareness of our present and the concepts which have given rise to our beliefs and practices at the precise moment in which we live. So transgenderism is a phenomenon which was born, has grown, and is very much alive in our present day. So making the contingency of gender medicine thinkable and historicizing the figure of the trans child that seems as if it's outside of history isn't cynical. Indeed, it is ethical. It makes the present, our truths and our practices open to reshaping, which I think is what we're doing here and what Genspect is doing by having produced and put on this conference. In contrast to realpolitik, I prefer Foucault's ethical solution, which is to protect the bodies of children through the practice of something that he calls paresia. It's a Greek term for speaking truth to power, even in the face of danger. W-Path needs to be shut down. This seems like an unrealistic goal, just as closing the Tavistock did in 2018 when I wrote the following. Only time will tell whether the Tavistock Gids ship has navigated so near to the rocky island of trans ideology that the clinic will eventually bring about its own demise. The tide may be turning as more and more concerned people gain knowledge of the absence of evidence-based medicine, of the irreversible harms of hormone therapy, of dissent deep at the heart of the Gids, and of whether the transgender child exists outside of political discourse. So only in a very brief period of time since I wrote those words, the Tavistock has, in fact, been closed. I hope that W-Path helps bring about its own demise by becoming even more bold about its lack of ethics. And I hope that bringing it down will be helped by each one of us who, in our own ways and following Foucault's advice, speaks the truth in the face of danger. Thank you.
You've persuaded me that Foucault is not to blame. But do you think that the basic concept of that in postmodern thought we've reduced reality to who controls the discourse about what's true, and that there's a kind of a disdain for empirical truth and biological reality? Do you think that's true and part of the problem?
I think it's true and part of the problem. Can you hear me at that? You're absolutely right. But the problem is that postmodernism is given a bad press too. You know, what has happened, I think, in our culture at the moment is everything is reduced increasingly to sound bites. So we will dismiss queer theory. We will, queer theory has become very sort of reduced and limited. At the time, it was quite briefly, for a brief period of time, it was quite powerful because all it did what feminism was doing, which was saying that there are norms, patriarchal norms which exist in the culture, and those who fall outside of it are treated as abnormal beings. So for a brief period of time, queer theory and the kind of feminism with which I identified were coalesced with one another. Very quickly, it became reduced in ways that I've just described. Postmodernism, again, is the idea that introduces the critical idea that in modern society we think of our sciences as leading us to an ultimate goal where science will, it replaces religion, and it's the human sciences which will lead us to the point at which we fully understand who we are and we will fully live together as peaceable people together. And postmodernism introduces a doubt about that. But these ideas then get taken up by people, reduced, commodified, and so on. So I'm not sure whether I'm answering your question, but I'm making a plea for complexity. That's what I'm asking for. Because if we don't have complexity, we're then, as individuals, reduced to hearing somebody who we admire, for example, saying that postmodernism is that, Foucault is that, so and so is that. And these opinions that are not necessarily based on any foundation then get interjected into the culture. And because we trust the people, we believe that they're truths. And I think this is a very dangerous position that we're all getting ourselves into. So if I could give any advice, not that you want any from me, it would be to hold back from this and to reclaim our own capacity as thinkers, as intellectuals, as practitioners, and try not to get too pulled into it. So, thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Very, very interesting. And I'm not going to try and defend psychoanalysis. I would just talk about one or two of the things as a clinician which might fit with what you're talking about that's going on at a sort of philosophical level. I mean, psychiatry, there's a sort of patients and psychiatrists sort of come together with a sort of idea that there's a solution to the human condition, which includes our biology. Patients in pain, psychiatrist wants to take away the pain. And the way that you see that is in the way that diagnostic criteria are used. I mean, we had this situation, didn't we, with lobotomies in the 1950s. 20,000 people in Great Britain had lobotomies. Last year, there were none. There was no evidence to it, but it's a sort of desperate physical intervention to solve chronic psychological problems. I just wanted to sort of mention the way diagnostic criteria works. At the beginning of the century, very small proportions of people were diagnosed with depression. Okay, sort of last year, half the population have got something called depression. What you get is this sort of diagnostic spread. And the drug companies, I'm not against medication, but the drug companies producing a medication and the diagnosis of what's called depression get larger and larger and larger. Yeah. And so nowadays, what we get with kids is they're all clamoring for some sort of diagnosis, ADHD. What was autism when Sue and I first trained is nothing like what's called autism now. Now, people are suffering from something. But the problem is you get this sort of idea. If I've got a diagnosis, I go to the doctor, I get a medical intervention rather than a sort of I'm struggling with conflicts over my sexuality, my body, whatever. And the doctor says, well, you've got this, and this is the solution. So patient and big pharma and get together, and we get this sort of growth in the idea that psychiatry can solve your psychological problems.
Can I just say that Marcus has just illustrated perfectly everything that I was talking about?
Oh.
Yeah.